Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, we've spent a lot of time on this channel talking about just how scary the ocean is. It's a pretty forbidding place, and there's no shortage of shipping disasters for us to talk about. The disasters we tend to talk about on the channel are often ones where we know what happened thanks to survivor accounts or even just messages in bottles. But the truth is, a lot of ships have gone down with nobody to tell the tale. And some of my favourite videos on this channel have been when we've talked about shipping mysteries that are still unsolved. From the disappearance of a magnificent fully rigged Danish training vessel to ghost ship sightings from around the world, these are some of my favourite videos that we've made that cover mysteries of the maritime world from history. This desolate stretch of coast along Namibia's Atlantic shore is one of the most remote and hostile on our planet. The indigenous people, the San, have known it for generations as the land God made in anger. Portuguese sailors in the 15th and 16th centuries called it the Gates of Hell. Its treacherous shores have been the ruin of many a fine ship, and today, dozens and dozens of wrecks litter the sands that make it up. Twisted, ruined and rusting, their remains have given this place the name by which it is best known today, the Skeleton Coast. In the autumn of 1935, though, the name earned a more literal meaning. 400 miles, some 643 kilometres northwest of Swakopmund, Namibia, an expedition returning from southwest Africa came across something startling. Pointing out of the shifting sands were sun-bleached bones. It was a human body, but that wasn't all. 7 miles away, 11 kilometres distant, 6 more bodies were found, long forgotten and stripped bare by the harsh winds. Their clothing was reduced to mere scraps. Local San tribesmen revealed something remarkable, the key that might reveal where these people had come from and how they ended up on the shores of the land God made in anger. Their story could link these bodies with a near decade-old mystery. 7 years earlier, the pride of the Danish merchant fleet, the magnificent and stately vessel Kobenhavn, the world's largest sailing ship, had set to sea from South America bound for Australia, but she never arrived. 4 days before Christmas in 1928, the ship had transmitted her final message saying, "All is well," but then she had disappeared, and the 60 people on board were never heard from again. Kobenhavn simply disappeared at sea, but what happened to her and her crew, and the twists and turns in the years after, make for one of the most compelling and chilling mysteries in maritime history. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today I'd like to tell you about a Christmas mystery, the story of the Kobenhavn, the ship that vanished into thin air. It's March 1921, and a fine ship is sailing the ocean for the very first time. She is called Kobenhavn, an enormous sailing ship with a special purpose. Kobenhavn is primarily a training ship for Danish merchant navy cadets. The ship's owner is Denmark's East Asiatic Company, first founded in 1897 by the shipping magnate Hans Niels Andersen. Ironically, although Kobenhavn is the largest sailing ship yet built, her owners have made their name through investing in highly modern technology. They've worked closely with the Danish company Burmeister & Wain and its director Ivar Knudsen. The company was most famous for their revolutionary new engines. In an era when steam was king, Burmeister and Wain developed Rudolf Diesel's eponymous engine into a viable propulsion system for big ships. In the 1910s, this was like untested territory, but the East Asiatic Company went all in. In 1912, the motor ship Zeelandia took to sea powered by diesels. As a sign of the times, the ship didn't carry a smokestack or funnel. She didn't need one. The fumes from her diesels could be vented up and out of the aft masts. The lack of smoke caused some consternation among other captains because a telltale smudge of smoke on the horizon was often the way other ships could first spot one another. This new smokeless ship was the portent of things to come. After the First World War, diesels began to take on, but it would take many decades yet for the technology to be applied to large passenger ships like it is today. With an organisation like the East Asiatic Company being this forward-thinking, it might surprise you that their prime training ship by 1921, Kobenhavn, was a sailing vessel. But although from the outside she looked old-fashioned, in reality she was the very latest thing in safety and modernity at sea. By the 1900s, it had become clear that the days of the sailing ship were almost over. Some clung on and were fast enough to find success in the lucrative South American nitrate trade or the grain trade from Australia, where the strong winds of the roaring 40s could propel them at great speeds. But the steam engine and the diesel motor put the vast majority of sailing operators out of business. But even then, as they began to die out and be scrapped en masse, a new kind of purpose began to arise. As a vessel dedicated to training inexperienced sailors, tall ships and barks, kind of sailing ship, were ideal. The sail handling and rope skills required were sophisticated. The manual nature of operating a ship like that, to bring it into harmony with the wind and the spray, to get as much speed out of her as possible, made building and operating sail training ships a popular endeavour. The East Asiatic Company's director, Hans Niel Andersen, personally believed that training cadets on modern motor steamships didn't imbue them with the patience and tenacity they needed to become good sailors. He was keen to introduce a dedicated sailing ship to show that his company produced some of the best sailors in the world. There was an element of national pride too. With the death of the age of sail, advanced sail ship techniques were at risk of being lost forever. Proud ocean-going nations could build and introduce magnificent tall ships manned by their cadets, well-drilled and superbly dressed. The training ship would serve as a kind of floating endorsement for the mother country. Russia, Germany, Belgium, Norway, and many more built and introduced their own dedicated sail training ships, even as the steam and diesel engines rendered other sailing ships superfluous. Of course, Denmark's merchant navy was there too, and the East Asiatic Company was keen to build and introduce their own. The shipbuilders Ramage and Ferguson had a long history of building very fine ships. In fact, their specialty was in constructing private steam yachts, vessels with fine lines and incredible luxuries for the hyper-wealthy of their day. But occasionally, they'd accept commissions for larger vessels, and in 1918, the keel plates were laid for a new, massive ship. Kobenhavn, named for Denmark's capital, was massive, some 432 feet, or 132 metres long, and 48 feet or 15 metres wide. With a bulk of some 3,900 gross registered tons, this makes Kobenhavn rank up there with the 10 largest sailing ships ever built during the Age of Sail. She got her propulsion from 5 towering wooden masts, some 58 metres or 190 feet tall, each of which carried enormous canvas sails, 40 in total, giving her nearly 50,000 square feet, or some 4,644 square metres of canvas to drive her majestically forward at up to 9 knots. Her sail plan was that of a bark, but she had a secret hidden below decks that could help her manoeuvre if the wind was lacking. Her owners had an old working relationship with Burmeister and Wain. Their diesel engines had powered their great achievement, the Zeelandia, back in 1912, and now they would give Kobenhavn an extra bit of power if she ever needed it. A single 640 horsepower, 4-cylinder Burmeister and Wain diesel engine could drive Kobenhavn along at 6 knots, and, to make reversing simpler, the propeller's blades could simply change their pitch, meaning that the ship could maneuver herself easily into tricky berths and docks around the globe. This bit of modernity isn't the only example though. Looking at Kobenhavn, you'd think the ship was a relic from a bygone era, but in reality, she was very modern. Below decks, her hull was divided into a series of watertight compartments by tall bulkheads, an unusual feature for sailing ships like her, because in ages past, the hulls had lacked any kind of subdivisions to help protect against flooding. It meant Kobenhavn could stay afloat with any two of her compartments breached and flooded, but by far, the greatest advancement was the fitting of a wireless radio and a dedicated operator. The benefits of wireless had been proven when Titanic sank back in 1912, and a rescue operation had been coordinated mid-ocean using Marconi's amazing invention. By the 1920s, the benefits and advantages of the wireless system were widespread, but still, it wasn't yet mandatory. For centuries before then, the only way ships had to communicate with one another was through visual means like rockets, flags, or semaphore signals. But now, ships could communicate with the shore or other vessels hundreds of miles away. Virtually all major passenger-carrying ships had wireless systems by the 1920s, but still, their implementation on other, smaller ships lagged. Sail training ships, being the last vestige of a long tradition of hardened, ocean-going vessels, sometimes weren't fitted with them. But the East Asiatic Company was a keen proponent of new technology, so Kobenhavn was. Now the ship could communicate with anybody at around 400 miles or 643 kilometers distance. But despite these technological advances, sailors are, after all, a superstitious lot, so there was ample opportunity for tradition. At the very forward part of the ship, at the bow, Kobenhavn sported an old-fashioned figurehead, carved and painted from timber, showing Absalon, the first Christian bishop of Copenhagen. But even forward of that, on the end of the bowsprit was fixed a shark's tail, probably by the crew and not the builders, said to encourage fair winds on long voyages. The ship served two roles, first and foremost as a training ship for young cadets, but equally as importantly, as a cargo vessel. Carrying cargo for the East Asiatic Company helped subsidise the vessel's operation, so to that end, Kobenhavn could lug 55,000 bags of wheat or 5,200 tons of other cargoes. Ramage and Ferguson, the shipbuilders, were justifiably proud of their new creation and delivered her in March 1921, but they probably weren't as proud as Hans Andersen and his East Asiatic Shipping Company. When Kobenhavn arrived from Leith on her delivery voyage, 12,000 people, including the King and Queen of Denmark, came out to see her. Aside from Isambard Brunel's Great Eastern, this was the largest sailing ship ever built in Britain, and one of only 7 5-masted barks ever constructed. Truly, she was something remarkable, and became the centre of attention everywhere she went. Her size and splendour earned her the nickname, the Great Dane. That really summarises the first few years of this ship's life, sailing majestically into ports, bringing curious onlookers out to see her, and serving as a billboard for the Danish merchant fleet. In 1924, the ship glided into Port Germain in South Australia, the cadets and officers immaculately dressed. They made a huge impression on the locals who came out to see her. One said, in the early morning, the largest sailing ship in the world, the Kobenhavn, slowly entered the bay and anchored. There were 3 large ocean-going steamers at anchor, and all the vessels had a good display of bunting. An air of briskness and importance was given to the pretty scene. Officers from the vessels engaged in cricket on the beach. Kobenhavn made herself well known to the people of Australia's coastal towns, with those from Port Germain welcoming the cadets ashore for dinners or day trips. For the young men who were honing their craft on board, to see such far-flung corners of the globe must have been remarkable. The cadets were young men trying to learn the ropes, literally, of life on a merchant vessel and hone the craft of sail. They were likely to end up serving on steam or motor ships, but to have a grasp on the basics of sail would see them equipped to serve aboard any other kind of vessel. Kobenhavn carried some 26 professional crew and around 45 cadets, who each assisted day to day in watches with the running of the ship as she sailed on weeks and months-long voyages across the globe. Day-to-day life activities included cleaning and maintaining the ship, polishing brass fittings and fixtures, attending lessons on seamanship, loading and unloading cargo, and, of course, rigging sails and actually running the ship. Life became a steady, normal routine for the youths, who typically aged between 14 and 20. They'd have their morning cleaning, watch duties and classes with some limited free time in between, along with meals and coffee. In her first voyage, Kobenhavn sailed over 38,000 miles, nearly 63,000 kilometres, and life aboard continued with its regular happy pace. The years passed. There were some dramas. The ship nearly burnt down in 1925 in the English Channel, for example. But aside from this, she was serving her company and her cadets well, each of whom was not just learning to become an effective sailor, but also getting to see the world. Soon, this glorious sailing ship would be seen no more in the world's remote ports, however, because the darling of the East Asiatic Company and the Danish merchant fleet was about to disappear. In 1928, Kobenhavn was under the command of Captain Hans Andersen on her 10th voyage. It had been a long year of the usual voyages. She saw as many varied ports as Chile and Gdansk, Liverpool and Adelaide, and Bangkok and Bangkok. In September that year, Kobenhavn set out once more from Denmark to Buenos Aires, Argentina, after which she would cut out east for a direct route to Australia. At Buenos Aires, the ship would unload her cargo of chalk and cement before loading a new cargo and sailing for Australia, where there she could pick up the well-regarded Australian wheat. She shipped a total complement of 60, including about 45 cadets and 14 professional crew. The first leg of the voyage to Buenos Aires went well enough, and the ship docked on November 17th, 1928, bringing out the usual throngs of spectators and visitors who gawked at the sight of the ship's sheer beauty. But here, Kobenhavn ran into a slight hitch. Usually, there'd be an easy cargo commission to pick up, but once the ship's crew had unloaded their original load of chalk and cement, none came. It caused a fair delay. After nearly a month of waiting, Captain Andersen had enough and decided to sail to Australia empty. Kobenhavn took on ballast, weight like sand designed to make up for the lack of cargo and provide some stability, and he set out for Adelaide, South Australia. As Kobenhavn glided out of port with her engine chugging away and her crew beginning to loose the sails, she must have looked a gorgeous sight, but this was the last anybody would ever see of the Kobenhavn and her 60 crew. The voyage should have taken 2 months. It would take Kobenhavn down south along the so-called Clipper route, where the ship could capture the full power of the roaring 40s trade winds that would carry her east, way under the Cape of Good Hope, towards Australia. Her crew, once they left Buenos Aires, wouldn't sight land again until they reached Australian shores more than 60 days later. This route had been popularised in the early 1800s when captains began to compete with one another to reach Australia in as quick a time as possible. By sailing further and further south, captains could cut days off their voyage by swinging down towards Antarctica before shooting back up at Australia. In 1851, the ship Marco Polo became the first vessel to sail from Britain to Australia and back in under 6 months by doing just this, but it was incredibly dangerous. The trade winds would whip up enormous waves and storms could languish for days on end. But even worse, sailing that far south towards Antarctica presented other risks, one which might have actually doomed Kobenhavn, but which, as the ship sailed quickly and neatly across the South Atlantic Ocean, the crew might have been oblivious to. On December 21st, 1928, in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, Kobenhavn was in touch with the Norwegian steamer William Bloomer via her wireless radio. They were midway between South America and the Cape of Good Hope and making good time. Everything well on board, Kobenhavn told the steamer. They reported that the crew and cadets on board were getting ready to spend a Christmas at sea in just 4 days' time, far from home and alone on the ocean. After a brief exchange of well wishes, William Bloomer steamed on, and Kobenhavn was out of range. But 3 months later, in Adelaide, Kobenhavn had not arrived. Back then, it was understandable that delays might occur. Ships often got held up for days or weeks in storms and fog. Relatives back home in Denmark began to grow worried. Their young lads were out there somewhere at sea, but the last anybody had heard was months ago when Kobenhavn had radioed that everything on board was well. Their relatives had sent Christmas mail to Australia ahead of Kobenhavn's arrival, but now it sat unopened and unclaimed. Niels Andersen, the East Asiatic Company's director and the ideator for the Kobenhavn, reassured the families that all was well. The ship was probably held up by a storm, or maybe picking her way through ice. Maybe they'd even hit a spot of no wind and were motoring slowly along under the power of their engine alone. Supposedly, the ship's captain was renowned for going quiet for long periods, distrusting the wireless and preferring to communicate through more traditional means. It's clear that Anderson was keen to prevent an alarm, but he may have been trying to calm his own nerves just as much. The Kobenhavn was his baby, and he was immensely proud of her. Then, a month later, there came some shocking news. The residents of Tristan da Cunha, a tiny group of volcanic islands in the South Atlantic Ocean, had seen something strange in January. A missionary had spotted a huge, 5-masted bark labouring through the ocean. He reported, "The sea was rough for our boats and we could do nothing but watch her gradually crawl past and run inside the reefs to the west of the island. She was certainly in distress. She was only using one small jib sail, and her stern was very low in the water. I estimated that she was within a quarter mile of the shore when we last saw her." Alarmingly, the ship's foremast was broken, but the crew must have been unfazed because they didn't try to land on the island, and instead they sailed on. Anderson jumped at the news. He ordered one of his company's tankers, the Mexico, which was equipped with powerful diesel engines, to go out searching for her fleet mate. Commanding this search effort was Captain H. Christensen, who'd actually been Kobenhavn's captain for 3 voyages, and had been replaced by Captain Anderson that past December. The ship motored off along the same route that Kobenhavn had followed, first reaching Buenos Aires, and then cutting out east across the South Atlantic Ocean towards Tristan da Cunha. The East Asiatic Company was in touch with Lloyd's and the British Admiralty, who agreed to assist in the search effort. A British steamer was sent to search some of the more remote stretches of coast. Through the Danish summer, Mexico motored through the ocean, but her crew couldn't find a single thing, neither the entire ship they were looking for, or a piece of her wreckage. 2 more ships, an Australian steamer and a Norwegian merchantman, had both been chartered by the East Asiatic Company to look for the missing vessel. Christensen, on board Mexico, began to believe that something had happened mid-Atlantic, and it was likely that the ship had washed up somewhere on the desolate coast of West Africa. A search proved fruitless. With 14 ships having exhaustively scoured every grid square on the map, the ships and their crews were at a loss. In September 1929, 9 months after Kobenhavn had last been heard from, Anderson and the East Asiatic Company got some devastating news. A Finnish shipping company passed on that their own ship, a 4-masted bark named Ponape, had passed by Tristan da Cunha on January 21st. That must have been the ship that the missionary had seen, and at a distance had just miscounted the masts. Anderson was shattered, and he openly wept. His darling ship and its crew were lost at sea with absolutely no trace. The search effort was cancelled, and Christensen and the Mexico were recalled back to Denmark. On September 6, 1929, the East Asiatic Company announced that Kobenhavn was officially lost at sea, and the Danish government echoed the news. For the families of Kobenhavn's crew and young cadets, as well as the Danish people as a whole, the news was a shattering blow. The next year, Lloyd's Registry officially listed Kobenhavn as lost. Over the years to come, Kobenhavn passed through the world's newspapers before interest began to wane, and the story was almost all but forgotten about. 1929 became 1930. A whole new decade had begun, but strange sightings began to be reported. In July 1930, an Argentinian crew reported spotting a 5-masted bark in a gale, possibly unmanned. From Chile to Easter Island and the Peruvian coast, fishermen and sailors began to report spotting the 5-masted ghost ship. Obviously, these all had to be taken with more than a grain of salt, but for Anderson and the families of the crew, it must have been gut-wrenching. Then, 5 years after the disappearance, there came a more tangible lead. A Finnish merchant ship had spotted wreckage south of Australia, reportedly from Kobenhavn and bearing its name, but the crew hadn't stopped to recover it. Then, just a few months later, came an even more sensational tale. A message in a bottle had been found. In September, the New York Times reported that the message had been picked up by a whaling ship, and it spoke of a brush with the ice out of Antarctica, and that the crew of Kobenhavn had been shipwrecked and were lost in the ice somewhere. But this proved to be a cruel hoax. The writing was taken verbatim from a Spanish novel. For the families, it was just another sad, dead end. In October, a statement was made from the parents which read, "We know our boys are dead, but it's terrible not to know how and why and where the tragedy happened. Perhaps too, there are some who cherish a faint hope, against their better judgment, that someday they will come back." Then, in 1935, there came some news that might actually give some clue as to what had happened to Kobenhavn. On the West African coast of Namibia, that returning expedition had made the unsettling discovery: 7 skeletons in the sand. What made the find all the more horrifying was what the local sand tribespeople had to say, that a few years earlier they'd found a smashed ship's lifeboat in the sand. They showed it to them and, curiously, it wasn't clinker built. That type of boat construction was almost universal in the 1920s, but Kobenhavn's lifeboats hadn't been clinker built either. Some of the bones were recovered and the skulls were forensically examined. Their bone structure seemed to confirm that these were of Nordic origin. Their scraps of uniform bore a resemblance to uniforms worn by Scandinavian merchant sailors. Legends persist that recovered hatbands even bore the name Kobenhavn. If true, that would have cemented the fate of the ship's crew, but curiously, the news was stifled. Anderson, the founder and director of the East Asiatic Company, was shattered by the events, and he never truly recovered. So what happened to Kobenhavn? Sadly, we may never really know, but there are a few clues that might give us a deeper insight. Assuming that the recovered skeletons and lifeboat did indeed come from the ship, it might paint a chilling picture, and it may turn out that the red herring message in a bottle, even though it was based on a fictional story, may have provided the most likely explanation. No wreckage from Kobenhavn was ever formally found, so obviously the ship sank, but how? If no lifeboats got away, it must have been sudden and violent, quick enough so that nobody got away and the lifeboats went unlaunched. A sudden storm with towering waves could have swamped the decks and smashed the boats. Captain Anderson had taken on ballast and sailed without cargo, but if the ship was improperly loaded, she could have capsized in the huge seas, her towering masts smashed under her enormous weight. But if the lifeboat and the bodies found on the skeleton coast did come from Kobenhavn, it would paint a very different story. With time enough to lower the boats and evacuate the ship, Kobenhavn may have sunk slowly, possibly from a fire she had after all caught alight years earlier. But there is in fact a more likely culprit. See, earlier we looked at the Clipper route, the route that takes many ships way south towards Antarctica as they sailed for Australia. It saved a lot of time, but it was extremely dangerous. In the southern hemisphere that December, it was summer. The warmer air temperature in the waters may have had an unforeseen consequence for Kobenhavn. As the ship sailed quietly through the waves, she may have encountered fog or a heavy storm. Moving slowly on, she had been battered by wind and waves, and then maybe encountered one of the most dangerous enemies to ships at sea: icebergs. Ice breaks free from Antarctica as the temperature rises around summer and drifts north in the currents into the South Atlantic Ocean. Some are tiny, but others tower high over the ocean's surface. In 1912, Titanic hit an iceberg in a field of ice that had done the opposite, drifting down south from glaciers in Greenland in the summer. In 1929, Kobenhavn probably encountered ice unusually further north in the Atlantic than Captain Anderson may have been anticipating. Now, this is not unusual. Dozens of clippers and migrant ships on the same route went missing over the years. Some, chillingly, were last seen spotted in the vicinity of ice. A collision with an iceberg in a storm could rent open the ship's hull and overwhelm her watertight compartments. Frenzied wireless messages might go unheard, the signal obscured by the heavy storm or the power put out by the flooding. In the end, one or more boats may have got away from Kobenhavn, but left drifting in the ocean with no alert made, rescue must have seemed like a faint hope. Carried far, far north, one boat might have landed on the West African coast, that isolated piece of land that the natives say God had made in anger. With no food or water, and after a weeks-long open-top voyage, the situation must have been dire. One skeleton had been found, miles away from the others, perhaps a lone member of the party striking out in search of water or food, while the others had stayed behind, too weak or beleaguered to follow. In the end, there was nothing to find. Overcome by the elements, they were all lost, their ships had sunk, and the world was none the wiser. Whatever actually happened to Kobenhavn and her crew, we'll likely never know. Today, we could easily use DNA testing on living descendants from Kobenhavn's crew to match the bones that have been found in Namibia, but unfortunately, the bones have since been lost, probably destroyed. There was some excitement in 2016 when searchers, using sonar to scan for the missing jet MH370, made a contact on the sea floor which turned out to be the hull of a metal sailing ship. Many thought this might be Kobenhavn, but on closer analysis it was found that the ship was far smaller than the Great Dane, only about 68 metres or 220 feet in length. The truth is, Kobenhavn is still out there, somewhere, possibly at the bottom of the southern Atlantic Ocean. We'll probably never know, and the fate of this fine sailing ship Kobenhavn will remain one of maritime history's most enduring and tantalising mysteries.
Now, disappearances can sometimes be very hard to explain, and this can be especially true of ships. It can be hard to imagine how a whole ship can just seemingly disappear into thin air. But it has happened for centuries and continues to happen to this day. Here are 4 of the most fascinating ship disappearances from recent history. This first ship was lost without a trace, and after messages in bottles began to wash up on beaches, it led to a tantalising mystery that still puzzles experts to this day. Long before the Titanic, the White Star Line had a fleet of impressive ships that battled their longtime competitor Cunard Line for Atlantic dominance. The liner Naronic was different to other ships though. She was built at a time when the company wanted to increase its capacity for transporting livestock, mainly American cattle, back to Britain. At the time of her launch and introduction in 1892, Naronic was the largest cargo ship afloat. She had capacity for just 15 passengers, but probably the most comfortable aboard the ship were the cows. At the time, much livestock was transported in cramped, terrible conditions on leaky ships, and many died at sea, at considerable expense to their owners. Naronic and her sister ship Bovik were different. They offered much better accommodation for the cattle, so they would survive the trip happy and healthy. Naronic was not destined to have a long career, however. In February 1893, the ship departed Liverpool for New York with 60 crew aboard, as well as 14 passengers, a pair of horses, and 2,800 tons of assorted cargo. There were no cows for this leg of the trip. These were picked up in New York for the return voyage to Liverpool. Naronic set out from Liverpool and stopped in North Wales before heading out to sea, but the ship was never seen again. It was just supposed to be a 10-day crossing, but when the ship failed to show, there was initially no alarm. It was common in those days for ships to be delayed by weather or even broken propellers or machinery. This was 1892, a few good years before wireless radio telegraphs would find their way aboard ships, so Naronic had no way of messaging shore or other ships to let them know what was going on. But after the passing of several weeks, it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. There was still no sign of Naronic, but in a typical PR move, the White Star Line called for calm and emphasised the quality and safety of their ship. They stressed that the ship is recent, built with watertight compartments, well equipped, handled and commanded by the best officers in the Atlantic. But then, in March, the company began to express concern for their ship. A search was mounted, and ships crossing the Atlantic were given extra lookouts, but it was all for nothing. The White Star liner Teutonic arrived in Ireland, having diverted themselves well south to look for the ship, but they found no trace. The White Star Line was forced to recognise the situation, and they announced, "We still hope that it can be safe, but it is unlikely that it will be found, because the Atlantic is crisscrossed by steamers and sailboats, and it would certainly have been spotted if it had still been afloat." Later that month, the British steamer Coventry spotted 2 of Naronic's lifeboats, empty and adrift, about 500 miles east of Halifax, Nova Scotia. One was capsized and the other was swamped. By June 1893, the ship was clearly lost, and an inquiry was set up to figure out the likely cause. Rumours abounded, and there were even reports of messages found in bottles washed up on beaches. One was supposedly found washed up on a beach 6 weeks after the disappearance at Ocean View, Virginia, and it said, 3:10 a.m. February 19th, SS Naronic at sea. To who picks this up? Report when you find this to our agents, if not heard of before, that our ship is sinking fast beneath the waves. It's such a storm that we can never live in the small boats.
One boat has already gone with her human cargo below. God let all of us live through this. We are struck by an iceberg in a blinding snowstorm and floated 2 hours. Now, it's 3:20 a.m. by my watch and the great ship is dead level with the sea. Report to the agents at Broadway, New York, M. Kersey and Company. Goodbye all. The letter was signed by Mr. John Olson, a cattleman, but the only problem is that, according to logs, there was no John Olson aboard the ship. The inquiry refused to accept the messages found in bottles as genuine. Later, a new theory emerged. Neuronic's cargo included dangerous chemicals like potassium chlorate, sodium sulfide, and calcium hypochlorite. If a storm had descended on the ship, those chemicals could have accidentally mixed if their vessels and containers broke in the rolling ship, and the result would have been catastrophic for Neronic. An explosion of immense size could have crippled the ship and led to a sudden sinking. A newspaper from the time ran a Norwegian captain's report at having spotted one of Neronic's lifeboats covered in barnacles, but clearly hastily prepared for lowering. This spoke of a sudden and unexpected departure from the ship. But sadly for Neronic's human complement, there was virtually no chance of rescue in the days before radio, and until the wreck is found, its final fate will remain a mystery.
This next ship disappeared on its maiden voyage, but unlike the Neronic, we have a much clearer idea of what happened.
The Hans Hedtoft was a brand new combination cargo passenger ship designed to carry refrigerated cargo. The ship wasn't huge by any means, only 82 metres or 271 feet long and about 2,875 gross registered tons. The ship was built in Denmark and was named after one of the former prime ministers of the country. The Danish Ministry of Defence secretly strengthened it to take 40mm anti-aircraft guns in the case of the outbreak of war. In January 1959, the ship set out on its maiden voyage from Copenhagen for Greenland, a voyage of around 2,100 miles or 3,400 kilometres. She made the first leg of the voyage in record time and began to call on ports before preparing for the return trip. She departed with 40 crew and 55 passengers on board, including a Danish parliamentarian. Critically, as well as a cargo of frozen fish, the ship was carrying a monumental archive, 3.25 tons of files relating to Greenlandic history and genealogy. But then disaster struck. In the late afternoon of January 30, a distress call was received by the US Coast Guard vessel Campbell. Hans Hedtoft had struck an iceberg and was sinking fast. A mayday and general emergency was declared, but aircraft couldn't be launched to help because the weather was just too poor. Hans Hedtoft was on her own, sinking without help nearby. An hour later, another message was transmitted declaring that the engine room had flooded, and then, at 5:41 p.m, another message requesting immediate assistance as the ship was sinking. But then there was silence. Nothing was ever heard of the Hans Hedtoft again. The Coast Guard ship Campbell reported that conditions were the worst ever seen, with huge seas and driving, freezing winds. The crew and passengers of Hans Hedtoft could not have stood a chance. A search was made for the ship, but no lifeboats were spotted. If they could even launch them in the terrible seas, they must have been swamped and sunk. On February 7th, the search was called off and Hans Hedtoft was declared a total loss. Aside from the tragic loss of life, the huge archive of files that went down with the ship was a major blow for Greenlandic genealogical studies. 9 months after the ship sank, a lone life preserver washed ashore in Iceland with the ship's name on it. It stands today as the only piece of the ship to ever be found. So what happened? How could such a modern ship be lost to an iceberg after all the lessons learned in the past? Well, Hans Hedtoft was different to other modern ships of the era, because instead of having an all-welded hull, the ship's plates were riveted together. At the time, this had been criticised. Ships in the far northern Atlantic were far more likely to encounter icebergs, and rivets are prone to popping under pressure in the event of a ship colliding with ice. Because the ship's engine room had flooded, it seems likely that a scrape with an iceberg opened up a huge seam along the ship's side as rivets failed, rendering the watertight compartments useless. The ship rests on the bottom of the Atlantic, undiscovered to this day.
The Hans Hedtoft disappearance can be logically explained, but sometimes ships just vanish and leave us guessing, and then wild theories take over. This is especially true of this next ship, the lovely, yet doomed, SS Waratah.
Waratah was built in 1908, a passenger cargo ship of considerable size for the time at 465 feet or 142 metres in length and some 9,339 gross registered tons. The ship was designed to carry passengers and cargo on the long voyage between Britain and Australia, and she had space for 432 passengers in cabins
and another 600 immigrants in temporary dormitories within the ship's cargo holds. The ship's first class was relatively comfortable and even featured a nursery for children, as well as a luxurious music lounge for performances. Like other ships of the time, Waratah featured a suite of safety features like watertight compartments and a cellular double bottom, which, her owners declared, made her practically immune from any danger of sinking. But unfortunately, this would soon prove not to be the case. On her second voyage in April 1909, the ship had departed Britain for Australia and disembarked her passengers and cargo. Then she began to make the return voyage to Britain. The ship's captain, Ilbury, was not impressed with the new ship, and he complained to the vessel's owners that it did not have the inherent stability of the company's previous vessels. There was even a heated exchange between the ship's owners and builders over this after Waratah's maiden voyage, but while a solution was considered, the ship set off on its second voyage. Waratah was steaming along the South African coast with almost 100 passengers aboard and a cargo of flour, dairy, frozen meat, and, tantalisingly, 7,800 bars of gold bullion. The ship made it to Durban, South Africa, and disembarked a few passengers. One was an engineer and experienced sea traveller, Mr. Claude Sawyer, who sent a message to his wife that said, "Thought Waratah top heavy, landed Durban." Sawyer was meant to sail all the way through to Cape Town, but decided to get off earlier because he was worried about the seakeeping behaviour of the ship. Waratah left Durban on the 26th of July with 211 passengers and crew, and was spotted the next day by a smaller ship, the Clan McIntyre. The captain of that ship recalled it was the worst weather he'd ever experienced in his 13 years at sea, with massive waves and powerful winds. Waratah sailed off into the distance, buffeted by the sea, and was never properly seen again. In the midst of the driving seas, Waratah ploughed ahead, intending to reach Cape Town on July 29th. But when the ship failed to reach its destination, concern began to mount. Just like Neronic though, this took some time because it was still common for ships in that era to be weeks overdue. But finally, in August that year, a search was mounted. The Royal Navy ship HMS Hermes was sent with 2 other warships to look, but the seas were still so heavy that Hermes' hull was breached and the ship had to be dry docked. On August 10th, some exciting news came from Durban. A vessel, seemingly matching Waratah's description, had been spotted slowly making its way towards the port. In Australia, the message was even read out in Parliament, and in the city of Adelaide, Waratah's first Australian port of call, the town bells were rung. But in the end, the ship was found not to be Waratah, and the vessel was still missing. For 4 months, the Royal Navy and the Waratah's owners searched, chartering vessels to find the ship. But in the end, no confirmed trace of her or her passengers and crew was ever found. No lifeboats, no life preservers, nothing. There were reports of a life preserver washing ashore on New Zealand with the ship's name on it, but this is hard to prove. And in the end, inquiries had nothing to work with except the discussions regarding the ship's stability before the departure. The inquiry found that the ship had been well built and was safe as could be at the time, but many former passengers from the maiden voyage and the first leg of the second voyage recalled pitching and rolling and the ship taking on a dangerous list. Confusingly though, other passengers and crew came forward to discredit these reports, stating that the ship was stable and handled well at sea. No obvious answer was evident, and in the end, only wild theories could be put forward for consideration. One theory had Waratah experience a dramatic cargo shift as she was carrying over 1,000 tonnes of lead and 300 tonnes of lead ore concentrate. This can liquefy, creating a dangerous situation for the ship as its stability is upset. This free surface effect could cause a capsize, and today, ore concentrate is treated as a hazardous cargo for this very reason. Another theory is that Waratah experienced an explosion, maybe of her coal dust or a boiler, which would have sunk the ship in minutes. But the most likely explanation is possibly the most horrifying: a freak wave. In heavy seas, waves can band together to create one massive, seemingly random rogue wave, which can have devastating consequences for any ship in their path. Waves like this have damaged massive transatlantic passenger liners. One even rolled the mighty Queen Mary about 50 degrees onto its side, and that ship was almost 9 times larger than the Waratah. If the ship really was experiencing stability issues, then a rogue wave catching it unaware would result in a capsizing and immediate sinking, a nightmare situation for any ship's passengers and crew, leaving no time for preparing or lowering the lifeboats. In the end, the ship's owners, the Blue Anchor Line, faced bankruptcy as ticket sales dried up. It entered voluntary liquidation in 1910 and sold all its assets off to P&O. Like the other ships on this list, today the Waratah's wreck lies somewhere on the sea floor, rusted and corroded, but still bearing the clues that could help solve the mystery of the ship's loss, if only it could ever be found. Our last ship today was revolutionary for its time, but like others on this list, it disappeared with all hands, and only messages in bottles give us a clue as to what might have happened.
The Collins Line was an American passenger steamship company doing its best to compete with its British competitors like Cunard Line. This was in the very early days of steamship services across the Atlantic. Before then, passengers had to brave wild seas in rickety sailing ships, and the trip took weeks. Instead, by 1849, passengers could sail on combination passenger ships like Collins Line's Pacific, which, along with its 3 sister ships, was the fastest, safest, and most luxurious ship of its day. In January 1856, the ship set out from Liverpool for New York with 45 passengers and 141 crew, captained by experienced skipper Asa Eldridge, who had previously set a world record for the fastest time across the Atlantic by a clipper sailing ship. That year, the icebergs had been particularly heavy, and captains were warned of their presence. The ship sailed off for New York, but disappeared somewhere along the way. This was long before the advent of wireless communication, and the Pacific seemed to have just vanished into thin air. Other ships were sent to trace out Pacific's route, but no sign of the ship could be found. Then, in 1861, 5 years after the disappearance, a message in a bottle was found washed up on the beach of an island off the Scottish mainland. In it was a chilling message. It said, "On board the Pacific from Liverpool to New York, ship going down, confusion on board, icebergs around us on every side. I know I cannot escape. I write the cause of our loss, that friends may not live in suspense. The finder will please get it published. W.M. Graham." After checking, Pacific's passenger manifest indeed included a British sea captain, Mr. William Graham, who was sailing for New York to take command of his own ship. Although the message's veracity couldn't be definitely confirmed, it remains the only and most likely explanation as to the ship's disappearance. A collision with an iceberg in the night would have been devastating to the ship in an era before many of the safety measures we are familiar with today. Unfortunately, owing to the vast size of the North Atlantic Ocean, we may just never know the ultimate cause of Pacific's loss, and it will forever remain a mystery.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, throughout history, there have been many examples of ships that left their ports and were simply never seen again. Most of the time, these ships were sunk or destroyed on their journeys, but occasionally there are ships whose fates are more mysterious. Here are 4 real ghost ships whose haunting tales remain a mystery to this day. Number 4, the SS Baychimo. The Baychimo was a German cargo ship built in 1914 and then sold to the Hudson's Bay Company as a war reparation in 1921. She spent the next decade plying the waters between Scotland and northern Canada. She was used to transport furs and for trading with Inuit settlements in the Arctic regions of North America. In late September 1931, Baychimo was struck by a blizzard near Point Barrow in Alaska, and on the 1st of October, she became stuck in pack ice. The crew, fearful for their lives and knowing that the ship could remain stuck for some time, chose to leave the ship and march across the ice to the town of Barrow. For the next month and a half, they would regularly return and try and clear away the ice from the hull until on the 24th of November, another blizzard struck the region. Afterwards, when the crew returned to the Baychimo to try and get her free of the ice, they found that she was actually missing. At first, they assumed that she had just sunk in the storm, but they soon received word from a hunter that the ship was in fact still afloat and had somehow drifted over 70 kilometers or 43 miles to the south. The crew tracked her down once again and managed to remove the cargo of furs from her hold before flying back to Vancouver and declaring the ship a total loss. This should have been the end for the Baychimo. It was unmanned and trapped in ice, and by all reasonable metrics, it should have just sunk a few weeks or months into the Arctic conditions, and yet, despite being abandoned and declared a loss by the company, the Baychimo would remain afloat for the next 38 years. The first sighting of the ghost ship came in 1932, when it was seen once again, having drifted 500 kilometers or 300 miles to the east, floating silently and completely intact. There were multiple sightings that year from dog sleds and prospectors. In 1933, a group of indigenous people stumbled across the trapped ship in a blizzard and took shelter on board for 10 days until the storm passed. The ship may have actually saved their lives, despite being abandoned and drifting through ice packs. Word had spread by now that the ship was still afloat, but the Hudson's Bay Company did not have any interest in trying to salvage her. Privately, some tried, but the thick ice in the area and dangerous weather meant that no attempt was ever successful. There were no more sightings for over 20 years between the late 30s and early 60s, but but in 1962, she was finally spotted again, drifting off Alaska's northern coast. It was incredible that after 30 years of abandonment and horrendous conditions, the Baychimo was still afloat and in good condition. The last known sighting of the Baychimo occurred in 1969, when she was found, having been trapped in ice once more between Point Barrow and Icy Cape. And though she has not been seen since, she has remained a famous ship for almost 40 years, having remained afloat on her own, sailing up and down Alaska's coast and surviving decades of ice and disrepair. Unfortunately, it's now very likely that the ship has finally sunk, because there haven't been any sightings of her since the late 60s. But in 2006, the Alaskan government began searching for all the wreckages of the thousands of lost ships in the north. Perhaps one day soon we'll learn where the final resting place of the Baychimo really is. The Carroll A. Deering. The Carroll A. Deering was a 5-masted schooner sailing ship built for the G.G. Deering Company out of the US. The ship was doomed to live a short life, operating as a cargo ship for only a year before it was found with its entire crew missing, drifting into port in North Carolina. In January 1921, the Carroll A. Deering was making a routine journey from Barbados to Norfolk. With 12 men on board and a short trip, it should have been a simple journey. And sure, at first, all things seemed to be going well. On the 29th of January, the ship passed by the Cape Lookout Lightship in North Carolina. The men on board reported that they had lost their anchors, but didn't mention any other issues. And besides, losing an anchor was fairly common back in the day. But just a few days later, on the 31st, the ship was seen drifting off Cape Hatteras. The sails were set, and the ship appeared in good condition to the observers on the shore. There was, however, one strange detail. There didn't appear to be a single person on board. The ship soon wrecked itself against the rocks off the coast, and members of the Coast Guard boarded it. On board, they found food prepared that had never been eaten, and the lifeboats were missing. The ship's log and navigational equipment was gone, as were the crew's personal belongings. Rumours immediately spread through the region, and conflicting theories emerged about what exactly had happened to the crew. Mutiny was chosen by the newspapers as the most likely scenario, but there was no reason that a mutinous crew would abandon a perfectly good ship. And why so close to their destination? Another suggestion was that pirates had taken over the ship. After all, another vessel, the Hewitt, had gone missing around the same time. Maybe there was a connection between the two. The mystery remained unanswered, and the wreckage stayed on the rocks offshore until on the 4th of March, the Coast Guard loaded it with dynamite and blew it up in order to prevent the wreckage from dislodging and becoming a danger to passing ships. There were no further leads until April of that year. A message in a bottle was found by a passerby on the beach, allegedly from the crew of the Deering, that told a compelling story. It said, Deering captured by oil-burning vessel, something like a chaser, taking off everything and handcuffing the crew hiding all over the ship, but no chance to escape. That was taken up by the newspapers of the time, and all of a sudden, the Russian communists were considered for the cause of the disappearances. There was a great deal of paranoia at the time about communist subversion of the United States, and there were rumors that they were plotting to steal American ships and cargo to sail them back to the newly formed Soviet Union. It was discovered in September, however, that the message in a bottle was actually a forgery from the very same man who had found it. He was attempting to get a job at a nearby lighthouse, although I'm not entirely sure why he thought the bottle would help, but anyway. With that, the communist pirate theory fell out of favour. The most likely explanation is probably also the most boring. Severe weather off the coast forced the ship near a sandbar, and the crew probably made the poor decision to abandon ship rather than risking being stranded during a storm. This would explain why the lifeboats were missing along with the crew. That, or she actually did stick fast on a sandbar, but the ship may have been freed by the waves and rode off in the currents without her crew. To this day, the answer to what exactly happened to the crew of the Carroll A. Deering is unknown, because the ship's boats and the bodies of the crew were never seen again. The MV Joyita was a luxury yacht built for an American movie director before being sold to the US Navy during the Second World War. In 1948, she was sold to the Louis brothers, who added a cork lining to the ship's hull and used her in Samoa as a charter vessel. On the 3rd of October 1955, the Joyita pulled out of Apia and set sail for the Tokelau Islands in New Zealand. It was a journey of about 400 kilometres or 248 miles, and was expected to take 2 days. One of the Joyita's 2 engines had actually failed before leaving, so the ship was already in a bad state when it finally left the harbour. Nevertheless, it pressed on with its 25 crew and passengers on board, including 2 children. No one would ever see any of these people ever again. On the 6th of October, the ship was reported overdue, and rescue vessels searched the sea between Samoa and the Tokelau Islands to no avail. The ship was declared lost until, on the 10th of November, a merchant ship sighted the stricken vessel, listing heavily, partially underwater, and devoid of any crew or passengers. The Joyita was 600 miles off course off the coast of Fiji. When a rescue team boarded the vessel, they found the radio was tuned to the International Marine Distress Signal. Clearly, they had been trying to call for help. The logbook, sextant, and all 3 lifeboats were missing. More concerningly, though, the ship's bridge had been destroyed and the windows broken. When the doctor's bag was found, there were bloody bandages inside. There was also more than 4 tons of cargo missing from the hold. Barnacle growth on one side told salvagers that the ship had been listing onto its port side for weeks. The ship was towed into Suva and examined by an inquiry team. The amount of fuel left in the tank had probably not been more than 50 miles from its destination when the disaster had struck. An inquiry found that a blocked drain in the bilge had caused the hull to fill with water, causing the heavy listing. The cork lining that had been installed a few years earlier, however, had kept enough buoyancy in the ship to keep it afloat, even with the water it had taken on. The radio was also broken, with a range that was limited to no more than 2 miles from the ship. There was never a chance of help reaching them, as nobody could receive their signals. An inquiry did find that a single engine would not have been enough to control the ship with that amount of water on board. The ship may have been struck by a storm, filling the hull with water. To the passengers, and possibly even the crew, the list might have made the ship appear to be sinking. It's possible that the captain ordered the ship abandoned, which explained why the lifeboats were missing. Another possible explanation is the captain had been incapacitated or killed, which had caused a panic on board. And this would explain the bloody bandages and why the passengers and crew had abandoned ship when the cork was still keeping it afloat, something the captain would have known about and factored into his decision-making if he was capable. Some more outlandish theories included being kidnapped by Soviets, again with the Soviets, murder from Japanese army holdouts still active in the region, and even pirates. These answers would explain why the cargo was missing from the hull, after all. Another explanation is that the crew simply engaged in a mutiny against a captain who they thought was incompetent. After the broken engine and radio and leading the ship into a storm that caused the vessel to list, the crew lost faith and took over. With only one engine, the mutineers took everyone in the lifeboats and tried to reach a nearby island before being swept away by the ocean. To this day, no one's sure exactly what happened to the people on board. Now, the damage to the bridge and the bloody bandages actually remind me a little bit of the recovered lifeboat and block and tackle of the ship the MV München, which went missing, and the damage showed evidence of contact with a rogue wave. If Joyita was in rough weather and a group of waves banded together to form one monstrous wave, it could have smashed with extreme force over the bow of the ship, crushing the bridge and seriously wounding anybody inside. With the captain and any senior crew killed or badly hurt, the survivors would have been dazed and terrified as their ship rolled over. They might have hurriedly filled a boat to escape and been lost at sea. This doesn't really explain the cargo though. Maybe the ship was rolled over by the wave, had its hatch broken and the cargo spilled out. In any case, after being recovered, the Joyita was repaired and used as a trading vessel, but she was repeatedly run aground on reefs and finally became abandoned one last time. She was stripped of valuable fittings and what remained of her simply disintegrated into the sea. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Some ships have been confined to the depths or remote shores and they've rotted away to bare nothingness, but for other sunken wrecks, the reality is quite the opposite. Seemingly frozen in place, these ships are a virtual time machine that give us a unique and captivating look into the past. From the heroic last stand of a US Navy destroyer, to the crushing destruction of a British expedition ship in the ice, the immediate sinking of a Swedish warship just after she was launched, to the harrowing final moments of a decapitated freight ship in a storm. These are 6 incredible preserved ships from around the world. First up, the small yet mighty USS Johnston. The story of the USS Johnston is absolutely wild and completely deserving of its own movie. The wreck was just recently explored and found to be in a state of wonderful preservation, with its guns still trained towards the enemy it was fighting when it was sunk back in the Second World War. When the Japanese attacked the United States on the 7th of December 1941 at Pearl Harbor, it prompted the largest naval buildup in history. Thousands of warships were built all across America to replace the losses at Pearl Harbor and to overcome the navy of Imperial Japan. In this frenzy of shipbuilding, the USS Johnston was born. She was launched in March 1943 and officially commissioned into the US Navy by October. At the ceremony, Commander Ernest E. Evans told his crew that this is going to be a fighting ship and I intend to go in harm's way and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. And this was a speech that the Johnston would certainly live up to. Despite only being in operations a little under a year, she would have a distinguished career across the Pacific, taking part in multiple battles and more than earning her place in naval history. Over the next year, the Johnston took part in fighting around the Marshall Islands, the Solomon Islands, and Guam, bombarding various beaches to prepare for American troop landings. In this time, she did not encounter many enemy vessels, as by this point in the war, the Japanese Navy had been severely reduced in size. However, off the coast of Bougainville around Buka Island, Johnston did encounter and sink the Japanese submarine I-176 on the 16th of May. This was the very same submarine that had damaged a heavy cruiser, the USS Chester, and then sunk an American submarine, so this was quite a kill for the Johnston. The Johnston was sunk on the 25th of October 1944, fighting the world's largest battleship during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This engagement was legendary, when a small group of American ships, commonly known as Taffy 3, came under attack from one of Japan's strongest remaining fleets, including the mighty Japanese super battleship Yamato, 3 other battleships, and no fewer than 8 cruisers. The Johnston led an almost suicidal counterattack in order to buy time for American aircraft carriers to escape, and for the Japanese to be fended away from a vulnerable force of US troop ships and landing craft nearby. This extraordinary bravery helped turn what should have been the Japanese brushing the Americans aside into a highly improbable American victory. One of the officers of the Johnston described the moment he saw the Japanese fleet as feeling like David without a slingshot. Nevertheless, just after dawn, Commander Evans gave the order to attack the enemy fleet with his small group of destroyers. For hours, the Johnston darted between the Japanese ships, firing all of its torpedoes and taking heavy damage. By 9:30 a.m., the ship was dead in the water and finally sank, taking with it 186 of its sailors and Commander Evans himself. The Japanese captain of the destroyer that finally sank the Johnston allegedly saluted the ship as it went down. Despite having a massively superior force, the Japanese fleet actually retreated after this engagement. The absurd confidence and bravery with which the little destroyers had fought were enough to rattle the Japanese into thinking they were walking into a trap. After being sunk, the Johnston disappeared into the Philippine Trench, sinking to one of the deepest parts of the ocean and being lost for more than 75 years until it was rediscovered in 2019. At a depth of 6 kilometers or 3.7 miles, this makes it one of the world's deepest shipwrecks. In fact, it may be that very depth of the wreck that has helped to preserve it. While the crushing pressure and extreme conditions have removed any trace of the crew that sank with their ship, it also means that there is little life to interfere with the wreckage, and it now sits in a very stable environment. Her number, 557, is still visible painted on the side of the ship, and its guns are still aimed to starboard, ready to fire upon the Japanese fleet. Interestingly, due to how well preserved the wreck is, shell holes can still be seen in the hull. Judging by the size of these holes, it appears likely that the battleship Yamato was one of the ships to land hits on the Johnston in the opening stages of the battle. An incredible fact, as it continued to fight on for hours afterwards, and a single one of Yamato's gun turrets weighed more than the Johnston herself. In fact, the Yamato alone had a larger displacement than the entire American force it was fighting that day. This small destroyer that took on the pride of Japan now sits in the ocean's deepest grave, perfectly preserved, and guns still trained toward the enemy. Number 2 on this list, the legendary expedition ship, Endurance. The Endurance is probably the most famous ship in the entire history of Antarctic exploration, and a ship that I was personally obsessed with when I was a kid. So you can only imagine my excitement when it was discovered just last year. Ernest Shackleton's legendary 1915 expedition aboard this ship is known across the world, but for over a century, exactly what became of it was a mystery. Since its rediscovery in 2022, we can now see and study this remarkably well-preserved relic from the early days of Antarctic exploration. The Endurance was built in 1912 in Norway, originally as the Polaris, and was intended to take tourists and scientists in luxury to Arctic regions. She had 10 passenger cabins, a dining room, a smoking room, and even a dark room for the development of photographs. No sails would be her primary means of propulsion. She was also fully steam capable and remarkably well designed. She was also made of wood. Steel and iron were by this point in time the usual materials a ship would be built of, but for certain tasks, wood was still the preferred material. Polar exploration was one of these tasks, as reinforced wooden hulls provided a platform that was both strong enough to break the ice and flexible enough to not be destroyed by the freezing conditions and most encounters with shifting ice flows. Unfortunately, the Endurance would, in fact, be destroyed by the ice flows, but at least the thought process was still there. Financial difficulties with the original owners meant that the ship would never operate in its intended role. Instead, it was sold early on to the British explorer Ernest Shackleton in 1914, who renamed the vessel to the Endurance, a reference to his family motto, Fortitudine Vincimus, or by endurance, we conquer. He set off in 1915 with a crew of 27, and they intended to use the ship to take them to the shore of Antarctica, and from there, they would cross the continent on foot. But unfortunately, the ship would become trapped in the sea ice in January 1915. Though the crew was able to start to break through the ice with the help of the ship's engines, the work was slow and arduous, and by February, the ship was stuck fast, and Shackleton could see that there was no purpose in wasting supplies and fuel in trying to break her free. The ship remained stuck in the ice and was used as an operating station for the crew to work from. However, the distance from the shore and the instability of the ice meant that the crew was unable to move too far from the vessel anyway. The Endurance was a well-built ship, designed to stand up to the intense pressures of the Antarctic ice, but eventually, even she had a breaking point. In November, the cracking ice and pressure against the ship became too much. The pressure against the hull caused failures throughout and essentially crushed the ship into pieces. When the ice finally broke again, the ship sank beneath the waves on the 21st of November, 1915. This event was captured in astonishing photographs by the expedition's photographer Frank Early. The crew of the Endurance would eventually be rescued in 1916 after an absolutely epic overland journey to seek out help, but the ship was thought to be lost until its rediscovery in March 2022. Interestingly, that was exactly 100 years since Shackleton's funeral in March 1922. The Endurance is resting in the Weddell Sea at a depth of 3 kilometers or 1.8 miles. The wreck must not be disturbed under the International Antarctic Treaty, and no artifacts have been brought to the surface. As for the ship itself, it is astoundingly well preserved, especially for a ship made of wood. Its structure has remained virtually unchanged since it was crushed by the ice, with even the hull and the ship's wheels still intact. Its rigging, though torn apart during the crushing more than a century ago, still rests on the deck, and it's managed to remain so well preserved due to the absence of wood-eating life in Antarctic waters. That doesn't mean that the ship is empty, however. The Endurance has become home to a variety of life forms, including sea sponges and anemones. Protected by treaty and distance, the Endurance will hopefully remain intact on the ocean floor for many decades to come. Number 3, the Swedish warship Vasa. When she was first built in 1628, the Vasa was meant to be the most advanced warship that the Swedish Navy had ever built and launched by that point. It was a huge, elaborately decorated vessel, and the hull was carved with intricate details depicting the Swedish royal family and King Gustav II. The deck housed 64 bronze cannons that would make the Vasa a fearsome weapon of war and serve as a symbol of Swedish military might all across the Baltic Sea. Many issues plagued the Vasa. The design had been meddled with and changed rapidly to meet shifting conditions, and it was sent to sea in spite of known instability problems. Though it was carrying 64 guns, it had been designed with only 32 in mind, and was therefore massively heavier than it was supposed to be. These problems were compounded by the fact that the king himself had ordered the construction and intended to make the Vasa the flagship of his fleet. Those in his government that were aware of the issues surrounding the vessel were unwilling to discuss the design flaws for fear of disappointing the king. In a stability test before the launch, 30 men allegedly ran side to side on the deck of the ship to see how long until it started to roll. They made only 3 trips before the possibility of capsizing became too great, and they were forced to stop the test. Despite this, the ship's launch continued, and it was put to sea on the 10th of August. It was almost immediately struck by a gust of wind that pushed the ship onto her port side. The gun ports below flew open and water filled the lower decks. In only a few minutes, the brand new warship sank below the surface. It was only 30 meters or 100 feet deep, so the tips of its masts stuck out of the water, but despite this, over 30 men drowned in the disaster in full view of the people of Stockholm and the king. The wreck of the Vasa was never lost in the same way that the other ships on this list have been. The location wasn't always specifically known, but people always knew the rough area in which the ship was located, and in the centuries between its sinking and its being salvaged and put in a museum, it was visited many times. Several attempts were made to raise the ship, but before 1961 the technology was too primitive to accomplish this. However, in 1961 the remains of the Vasa were raised from the ocean and are now housed in the specially built Vasa Museum. What was extraordinary was just how well preserved the Vasa was, despite having been resting on the ocean floor for over 300 years. An estimated 95% of Vasa's wooden hull was intact due to the cold, salty water it had been resting in. This killed microbes that might have otherwise eaten the wood. On board were around 20 skeletons. Most of these were sailors, but women and children were also found on board, which indicates that the sailors had brought their families to sea with them. Also on board were the remains of food and animals, but probably the most incredible item recovered from the wreck was a perfectly preserved human brain. One poor sailor had his head crushed in by a cannon as the ship rolled and sank, and remarkably, the metal cannon protected his skull and the brain inside. When the body was recovered 333 years later, not only was his skeleton still dressed in his well-preserved clothes, but his brain was able to be retrieved from inside his skull. It had shrunk way down and turned to adipocere, a sort of waxy substance which can happen to well-preserved bodies in watery environments. This well-preserved wreck provides an archaeological tool of incalculable value, as well as offering a fascinating attraction to tourists in Stockholm. In fact, the Vasa Museum is now the most visited museum in Scandinavia.
Number 4 on this list is the captivating wreck of the SS President Coolidge, which started life as a luxury liner and is today instead guarded by a moray eel.
President Coolidge was an ocean liner built in the early 1930s to capitalize on the passenger trade across the Pacific, running from San Francisco out to Manila and Kobe. The ship, along with her sister, President Hoover, was designed with the upper class in mind, those who had money to drop on expensive ocean-going holidays across the Pacific. She was fitted throughout with sumptuous fittings and novelties like telephones and a soda fountain, the latter of which, because this was the height of the Prohibition and the ship, being US flagged, wasn't able to stock alcohol. In the lead up to the Second World War, the ship was used to evacuate refugees fleeing the advancing Japanese Imperial Army. But then, in 1941, she was called up as a troop ship. At first things went well for her. Most of her luxurious features were gutted so that she could fit in as many as 5,000 troops, and she sailed in convoys, even visiting Melbourne, my hometown. But then her luck ran out. In October 1942, the ship was attempting to navigate its way through a wide main channel into Espirito Santo harbour when it was rocked by 2 huge explosions. Mines had been laid in the channel, but this wasn't passed on to the ship's captain, Nelson. He immediately knew he was going to lose his ship, so he drove it onto the land in an attempt to beach her and prevent a total sinking. But unfortunately, she came to rest shy of the shoreline on a coral reef, which prevented the full beaching. Regardless, over 5,000 men evacuated the ship down ladders in a neat, orderly fashion, with some even simply just walking ashore. And as the ship began to settle in the water, Captain Elwood Hewitt, an artillery officer, heard tell that there were men trapped in the infirmary on board. He raced back and rescued the men, but he was lost in the attempt. Only he and one other man who'd been killed in the initial mine blast lost their lives that day. The President Coolidge, once the favourite of millionaires and wealthy Americans, rolled onto her side and sank beneath the waves when she slipped off the reef. After the war, President Coolidge was stripped of many valuable fittings, including her propeller blades, electric motors, shell casings, and copper tubing. Today she lies on a slope so that the bow is only 70 feet or 21 metres deep, while the stern is over twice that. But divers today can see many remnants of the ship's past as a luxury ocean liner poking out from the silt. The most famous piece is known simply as The Lady, a porcelain relief of a woman and a unicorn, still in vibrant colour. But elsewhere on the ship are reminders of her military career, rifle rounds, and even jeeps, which were supposed to be delivered to the American forces in the Pacific. In the medical bay, jars and bottles of medicine still line shelves that the doctors and nurses would once have used to treat ailing soldiers. At the time, the President Coolidge was carrying an enormous stock of quinine, over 200 kilograms or 591 pounds, which was crucial in treating malaria. Down in the engine room, you can still find gauges and levers. Give the glass a wipe and you might still be able to make out the readings from the dials. Elsewhere, toilets line the walls and bathrooms still have their tiles, wash basins, and baths intact. Scattered around the seafloor are piles of gas masks and even coral-encrusted rifles. Divers today are familiar with the wreck's unlikely guardian, a giant moray eel named Nessie, who was taken to living in the winches on the wreck's bow, and passing divers even feed her when she pops her giant head out to say hello.
Number 5 on this list is the terrifying sinking of the Daniel J. Morrell. Unfortunately, I can't legally show you many of the incredible photographs taken from inside this ship, but the story of its sinking is almost beyond belief, and I'll provide a link down below in the description for you to see some amazing photographs taken from deep within the wreck in the recent past.
Of all the ships on the Great Lakes, it's probably the mighty bulk freighters which attract the most attention and fanfare. The Daniel J. Morrell was a huge ship built in 1906 and nicknamed the Queen of the Lakes because at 603 feet or 184 meters in length, she was the longest ship then afloat in the region. The ship was used primarily to carry bulk cargoes like iron ore, coal and grain. For an incredible 60 years, the ship faithfully did just that. But then in 1966, the ship's impressive career came to a shocking and violent end. It was the last run of the season in November, and the ship was sailing empty of cargo when a monstrous storm rolled in. Winds topped 70 miles per hour or 110 kilometers per hour, and waves crashed over the height of the ship. She steamed desperately for shelter at Thunder Bay. By 2 a.m, had taken on so much water that she seemed doomed. Her crew assembled on deck and they were battered by winds and waves, many jumping or being washed overboard and lost in the freezing, surging water. But then at 2:15 a.m, the long ship broke in half, and the remaining crew in the bow section were able to load themselves into a raft. Then there came a call of relief. A ship's lights were spotted off in the distance. The men must have thought they were saved, but then to their horror they realised that this looming shape wasn't a rescue ship at all. It was the second half of their ship. The boilers and engines had remained intact and they were still turning. Now the zombie stern section was chugging along by itself in the water, totally out of control and bearing straight down on the raft. At the last minute, the raft was washed clear and the stern section disappeared off into the darkness, described by author William Radigan as being like a great wounded beast with its head shot off. In the end, there was only one survivor who had clung to life through the wild and frigid night. He was found in a lifeboat with the bodies of his comrades who didn't make it. The truth was that the old cargo carriers like Daniel J. Morrell were simply too long and used too brittle a grade of steel to stand up to the forces of a storm at sea, and many were lost when they were swamped or broke in half. And probably the most famous of these was the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Daniel J. Morrell's wreck was found in 1980 in those two halves, with the stern section some 5 miles or 8 kilometers away from the bow. As always, the most haunting relics are those that tell the stories about the human cost. A single shoe sits in the silt, long separated from its owner, a chilling reminder of the 28 men who lost their lives the night that Daniel J. Morrell broke its back and sank. Finally, we'll end on what is potentially one of history's most unlucky ships. Today, you can see part of her bow peeking out from above the waters in Captain Bay, Unalaska, and her story is nothing short of bizarre. Northwestern started out as a steam-powered freighter in 1889, built in Pennsylvania for services around Alaska. From the outset, though, the ship earned a reputation for trouble, suffering from groundings and collisions that would last throughout her career. In 1907, the ship first ground on a reef, was refloated and underwent repairs, but she was beached again soon afterward, having developed a leak. She was again refloated and was towed for repairs, but then the tug towing her ran aground in the fog. Later on, she collided with another ship in 1911 and ran aground again in 1910, 1913, 1915, and again years later in 1933. But remarkably, she was refloated every time. I can't tell if this is the luckiest or unluckiest ship in history, but for some reason the US Navy thought it would be good to put this absolute lunatic of a vessel into service during the Second World War, and she was used to house harbour workers in Unalaska, the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese bombed the area in June 1942, but of course Northwestern was hit, badly damaged and consumed by flames. She was abandoned and eventually sank on the spot in around 1946 in Captain Bay. Nowadays, a good portion of the Northwestern's hull remains visible and recognisable above the waterline. The bow sticks out, rusted to a dull orange, but you can clearly make out the rough shape of it and the houses for the anchors. On the forward deck, the ship's anchor windlass sits intact where it was fitted 130 years ago, but moving further aft from there, the ship's side plating has begun to fold inward like wet cardboard. If you look closely, you can see the remains of the ship's forward mast, which once stood proudly over the vessel but now lays draped over its decks, which themselves are covered in a nice dense layer of green turf. Be a nice spot for a picnic. Northwestern is a fascinating ship with a strange story, and her little-known wreck, which itself is in such a good state of preservation, is probably one of the most interesting of its kind in the world. I'm Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and even though I'm supposed to be on holiday and not thinking about ships, I can't help it. So today, we're going shipwreck hunting. I know it really doesn't look like much, but believe it or not, around me, there's a huge shipwreck. Today, I'm on the Great Ocean Road in Australia's southeast coast, in the state of Victoria, my home state. For hundreds of years, the only way for Europeans to get to Australia was to sail right past here, right under the bottom of Australia, on the way back up to, say, Melbourne and Sydney, which were the two major trading hubs in the 19th and 20th century. This presented a serious issue for ships of the era, because without modern-day guidance systems and navigation, at night time, and especially in a storm, it was impossible to see where you were going. And this is not the kind of coastline you want to be bumping into. But of course, a lot of them did. And so we know that there are probably about 300, maybe 350 wrecks in this stretch of coast. A very dangerous bit of ocean. And this was the era of the clipper, a fast, ocean-going sailing ship, fully rigged. Often the conditions were abysmal. I mean, there's a fair degree of romance afforded clipper ships now, but at the time, they were purely utilitarian. They were kind of like the big cargo freighters that you see today. Some of them are wrecked on the coastline here and have gone down in history, like the Speculant, but also the Lockard, probably the most famous of them all. So I'm going to give you a quick tour of the wreck site to give you an idea of exactly what it is that we're looking at and some of the clues that can tell us what the ship might have been, how it ended up here, and how exactly it came to rest on the rocks. So first of all, is this point here, on the sand behind me. When I was younger, there was a large hawse pipe. Now this pipe would have fed the anchor chain through and out the side of the ship. So that gives us a rough indication of where the bow came to rest. And this point over here behind me, maybe about 30 or 40 feet away from where the hawse pipe was discovered, has all kinds of bits and pieces of debris, copper, random bits of steel and iron that have just melted into rock. But most importantly, there's tons of bluestone. And this is really important because bluestone isn't natural to this coastline, and it's only here for like 100, 150 feet. What? She almost fell in. And this is really important because bluestone is not natural to this coastline, and it's only here for like 100, 150 feet, which indicates that she may have been carrying bluestone as cargo away from Melbourne for trading, or potentially using it as ballast. It's hard to tell. As you can see behind me, it's everywhere. Based on the fall of bluestone, we can gauge where her hold might have been, where the ship burst open as these big waves came rolling in and gutted her. The ship would have basically over time exploded, and all of the relics have been washed up under these rocks. And so this is where we find a lot of small pieces, even personal pieces like decorative inlay, pieces of brass, glass, and that kind of thing. So we're going to have a look in here in a minute. And then heading over here, it's probably my favorite piece of the wreck, but unfortunately, it's underwater, so I can't show it to you at the moment. I tried coming here during low tide, but no dice. But in this little crevice, there's a wash basin. An old, enameled wash basin. And this is a really crucial piece because it's so far away here from the rest of the wreck, over there. And typically, on older ships of that era, it was the captain who had access to amenities, like wash basins. And of course, the captain's quarters were often in the very stern of the ship. So it stands to reason. Now, this is where the stern of the ship came to rest. That is where the hull broke apart. And a little further over there, where we found the hawse pipe all those years ago, probably where the bow ended up. So we can get an idea that the ship smashed onto the rocks, potentially starboard side on, or maybe bow on, and then was blown onto her starboard side. And that over time, the ship dissolved, broke apart, and everything that's natural fiber like timber, rope, and canvas have all rotted away. But we still have pieces of metal, copper, iron, and steel that tell the story of the wreck. So we're going to do some digging, and we'll see what we can find. What is it? Amazing that while I was just filming my monologue, my assistant I just found this piece right here that we'll extract right now. Now that is a beautiful piece of rigging from the ship. This is steel rigging. You can see that it's been worn down over the course of 100, 150 years by the ocean. You can just make out the individual strands of wire that would have been wound around to make this this stay, which would have probably held part of the mast to the ship. And it was sitting right there for 100, maybe 150 years. Unbelievable. The more I look into this rock pool, you can see there's bits of iron and steel and everything just all melted. Oh, I think we just disturbed a little crab here. Look. Oh, he's just hanging out. Sorry, buddy. See that piece there? Another. Oh, there's a crab right next to it. Beautiful piece of rigging that's just shattered. These are two individual strands of probably steel rope that would have formed one of the metal stays for the mast. That's amazing. It's just sitting there, you know? Incredible. It's funny just walking along, you find just big pieces of nondescript iron that have melted into the rock. You know, ashes to ashes. Slowly the ship dissolves into the ocean. It's not just steel that you get here either. It's these beautiful pieces of copper sheathing. Back in the day, to protect the wooden hull of the ship, these huge pieces of copper sheet, very, very thin, were nailed to the side of the ship to protect it from corrosion, protect the wood from rot, and to increase the speed of the ship. You can just see some of the original copper color right there, but time has turned it green. You see this exact kind of copper on the hull of the Cutty Sark. Now in this big rock pool here where you can see the bluestone, this is roughly where the hull of the ship came to rest. Straight away you can see big pieces of iron, like that one. But this is the kind of thing you want to keep an eye out for. Wait until you can see the green of the copper just sticking out right there. Look at that. That's a beautiful piece. That's part of the hull right there. Of course there were nails that held this kind of copper to the hull of the ship. Unfortunately, there are tons of those nails still left, but I've just found a bunch. Hard to make out. You can just see that telltale green. Let me just pull this a little bit up. And that looks like, to me, a bunch of nails all melted together. Let's see if there's... Oh! There's one by itself. Look at that. Copper nail. It's interesting. It's got a square profile. You can just see that. It's not rounded like modern nails, because of course this was all cut from a single piece of copper wire, square in profile. Unbelievable. And this, much clearer now. It's a bunch of nails all just melted together. You know, you wonder if this was from the hull or if this was actually just a box of nails that has just disintegrated. The wood's been eaten away. You see that kind of thing with plates and bowls on the wreck of Titanic. You'll see stacks of plates that once would have been in boxes, all in a neat row, but all the wood's been eaten away. Amazing. So while my assistant keeps looking at bits and pieces down here on the waterfront, we're gonna go up here and check these rocks out, where the bulk of the ship's hull broke apart and was buried with time. We'll see what we can find. God, do you think I could have found an older shovel? This actually just looks like part of the shipwreck. God, that is an awful sound. It's funny, this is really hard digging because of all these rocks. But it's worth it, because you find this stuff here, whatever this is, being protected by a little bug. Maybe you won't mind if we pull this up, but this looks like a big piece of rigging. That steel rigging that we've been pulling up. Oh. Let's go brush it off and have a look. This is, without a doubt, the biggest and most intact piece of rigging of this era that I've ever seen. This is incredible. It looks like it Came just off the ship. Look at that. Unbelievable. You know, I wonder if it's part of a single line spanning from there to there. Maybe one of the masts fell right over here and took the rigging with it. But that is an unbelievable piece. We don't want to disturb the environment too much because here in Australia it's actually illegal to keep pieces of shipwreck. So whatever we find, if it's small and insignificant, we're going to put it back and leave it where it is. But if we find something maybe a little more important, we'll be contacting the local maritime museum and making a donation. It would be great to find a clue that could tell us the name of this ship. It's amazing that just pulling up rocks over here, you find these things that weren't even buried. I can only assume this is a big piece of maybe a pulley system or a block or a shackle. And this definitely looks like a big shackle from the mast, maybe from a yardarm or a spar. You can imagine the body of the spar or yardarm going right in the middle of that, and then this being secured at the other end. What? Wow.
We're going to chicken dinner.
Whoa. That is unbelievable.
I told you, I need to get a wetsuit and go in there.
Big piece of copper. And what's incredible about this one is it's still got the holes there for the nails that would have held it to the ship's hull. Unbelievable. Compare that with the piece that I just found. And it's clear that there is somebody who is much better at this than I am. It's incredible when you take the piece that we just found and the nail. There's a perfect fit. Look at that. Good as new. So this would have been the exterior surface of the copper, and this would have been the ship's hull right here, the wooden beams of the ship's hull. And these nails would have held the copper right onto the side. You do wonder if this was a gravesite, if anybody was lost in the sinking, or if they maybe died of exposure. Conditions in the voyage out to Australia at that time were absolutely horrific, and it didn't really change much until the advent of steam, when ships could be bigger and safer and more comfortable. For immigrants or even convicts coming out to Australia, it must have been a terrifying time. You're tossed about in relatively small wooden ships, totally out of your element in what were often uncharted waters. The food would have been horrible, and it was a months-long voyage, 6 months plus. And to think that so many of them, hundreds of them, were so close. We're less than 2 hours drive from Melbourne City. Often, these were just people looking to make a better life, and to have risked that voyage out, you can only imagine what conditions must have been like back home for them. But they were so close to making it, and they end up smashed up on these rocks. It's really sad. But it's also a major part of Australian maritime history, so to be able to come here and actually interact with it really makes it feel not that long ago. The fact that it's just sitting right there is amazing.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.